welcome everyone. Today we are diving into a conversation that is as frustrating as it is important: teens and their right to read what they want. Book bans and challenges are unfortunately on the rise, and too often the books that get pulled from shelves are the very ones that could help young readers make sense of the world around them. But here's the thing: teens are already encountering complex, sometimes uncomfortable topics in real life. So why are we so afraid of them finding those same themes in books? To unpack this, we've got three fantastic guests here with me today. Wendy Burch-Jones is a K-8 teacher librarian who sees firsthand what kids actually want to read and what happens when you tell them they can't. Lawrence Hill is an award-winning author and knows what it's like to have his books challenged and why it's crucial to tell the stories that make people think. And Maria Martella, a children's books distributor and owner of Tinlids, understands the behind-the-scenes pressures to keep books quote unquote safe and why that's not always the right approach. So let's get into it. Before we head into our first question, I forgot to introduce myself. Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Arbuckle, Executive Director of the Ontario Library Association, and I'm also heavily involved with the Freedom to Read Week campaign, and I'm happy to be moderating today's conversation. So let's jump into our first question. Why do teens need the freedom to read? Let's get to our first question, which is kind of getting into beyond everyone in their professional fields. I know that each of you is also a parent and have parented or are currently parenting teenagers. So you all have very unique perspectives on what young readers are drawn to. So if you would take a moment to just introduce yourselves so we can all hear your voices and share a moment where you have seen a teen, your teen or really any teen, deeply connect to a book, perhaps one that was controversial or challenged, and what that moment revealed about why teens need the freedom to choose their own reading material. And I'm going to start with Maria.
All right. Well, the story that stands out mostly for me was around a book talk I did for a group of teens at a Toronto school. And it was in preparation for a talk I was giving at OSLA Super Conference called Grit Lit. I decided I wanted to talk about some novels that were a little bit more mature and edgy, maybe the novels that adults are afraid to give to teens, but teens love. And so I went to a school and I brought about 15 to 20 books. And I started talking just in general about why I was doing it. And the first question I asked before I started the book talk was, how do you feel when an adult tells you that this book is too mature or this book is too edgy for you? I don't think you're ready for this book. I've told this story several times, so maybe some of our listeners already know it. But the boy that spoke first just stood there and started telling me every adult that has given him a book to read, in that book, the character has a better life than he does. He said, no book is too mature for me. And then he proceeded to tell me that his mother had died. He lived with his uncle because his dad was in jail. They lived in the motel behind the school. I had never been to this school before. I knew nothing about these kids. You know, my lens was I'm looking out at these kids, and in my mind, I have no idea what their hardships are, if they have any. And so this boy was just completely opening up in front of his classmates, and then, you know, proceeded to tell me all of this and saying that, you know, nothing could scare him, basically. Nothing could be too hard for him to read, which was a real eye-opener for me. And I started to think about, you know, social media. Isn't that what social media does that we are so worried about for our children? It tells us that everyone has a happy life. Everyone's life works out. Everything is okay. Other people are luckier than we are. There's no one else like, you know, going through the hard things that we're going through. So that really has had a real lasting effect on me, and it gave me more courage to you know, present grittier and sadder and all of the tough topics. You know, I know that there are, like myself, when I was a teenager, I liked books that made me cry. So, you know, for whatever reason, these tough topics are really important. And I think that, you know, teens need the freedom to choose their own reading material because they're learning what it means to be an adult. And if they have hardships, then they learn that they're not alone. And if they don't have hardships, then they learn about people that they may meet later in life, or they may encounter hardship later in life that, they might remember how the character handled it. They should be exposed to different types of people
Mhm.
that they're going to meet in the world as adults, and they can experience all of these scary, tough, sad topics in the safety of their homes, school, library, or wherever they may be. But it's an indirect experience that they're getting. So I really feel like it's so important to give teens choices and make them feel like we trust them and that we can trust that they can handle what life has to, what life will present them with in the future. So,
Excellent. Thank you, Maria. I'm going to go to Lawrence next.
Well, thank you, Michelle, and really nice to share the stage with you, Michelle and Maria and Wendy. My name is Lawrence Hill. I'm a writer and a professor of creative writing at the University of Guelph, and have 5 grown children. And they all were big readers when they were young, but the biggest of the readers in our family was Evangeline, and she's now like 28. But about 18 years ago, she was devouring everything she could find by the Canadian writer Deborah Ellis, mostly, of course, her fiction. But about 18 or 19 years ago, Deborah Ellis brought out a great new book of nonfiction called Three Wishes Palestinian and Israeli Children Speak. And it was a book in which the author doesn't really appear, but monologues of children that she interviewed, an equal number of Israeli and Palestinian children, just speak about their lives, about the fabric of their day-to-day lives with the backdrop of war and violence, and what their lives looked like as children. And the author sort of steps out of the way and just lets these children speak about the texture and the fabric of their lives. It was a really interesting book. Eve devoured it. The book was nominated for one of the Forest of Reading Awards. And then, of course, school boards and certain organizations and individuals started hectoring against it and arguing that it should be pulled because some people objected to the voices of the Palestinian children. And Eve was incensed, and she didn't like the fact that adults should be telling her what she could and what she couldn't read. And did they really think that she was so foolish as to believe that just because some child espouses or has a family member who espoused some sort of hatred or intolerance, did that mean that she was going to buy into that same hatred or intolerance? And she was quite resentful that adults should be having these conversations among themselves about what she was not fit to read. And she stood up and spoke about this in public and was interviewed on the National, and ended up getting a Freedom to Read award from the Writers Union of Canada for her advocacy. And so that was a family experience in which a young child of mine, 10, was just incensed by all these adults talking around her, telling her what she could or couldn't read.
That's great. Thank you, Lawrence. Wendy, I'm sure you see this happening every day, but can you tell us about when you've seen teens deeply connect to work and what that says to you?
Sure. So I am a teacher, librarian in a K-8 school in Toronto in the West End. And it's a large school, and there are just between 600 and 700 students there at any given time. I also have 2 teenage boys in my house. Neither one of them are avid readers at the moment. They've had their moments of reading. But certainly in my school, as I we run the Forest of Reading program. We have, of course, lots and lots of students who read all those fantastic, fabulous books. And I am lucky enough to be able to engage with those kids on a regular basis with those books. And just a few weeks ago, I had a student come up to me, and we were chatting about one of David Robertson's books that is nominated this year, The Kodiaks. And it is a story of Indigenous family who moves to the city when they're one of their children is playing hockey. And I asked her, and I said, "So what's the book about?" And I said, "Is it about hockey?" And she looked at me with this look of indignation. No. And excuse me. And she said, no. And she was really, really clear, even though the book revolves around the hockey team and all of the things that are happening. She was so absolutely clear that the author's intent was not at all about the hockey, that is, while the overt plot is about hockey, that the purpose in writing that book was not at all about the hockey. And she went on, and we talked long past recess. I had to send her a note back with her teacher because we talked for about 15 minutes past recess, because she wanted to be super clear with me exactly what the author's intent was, that she had connected very deeply. This was a student who has never played a game of hockey in her life. I'm not even sure she has watched a hockey game in her life. And so she has no connection to the game of hockey, but she connected so deeply with his book, and was really clear exactly about why David Robertson had written that book, and had read this child, a 12-year-old in grade 7, had read all of the undertones, absolutely all of the subtext in this book. And it made me think of the Rudy Ann Sims Bishop theory of windows and mirrors and sliding glass doors, where we have all these fantastic stories and we give them to our students to read, to not only reflect back their own experiences, but also have glimpses into the lived experiences of others. And for me, that's the real value in having students connect with these books. And absolutely, David's books have been banned all across the country for lots of different reasons. And this particular one, I'm not sure it's necessarily been banned, I'm going to say yet, unfortunately. But this particular one, she was so clear exactly why it had to be written, and all of the discrimination and the anti-Indigenous racism that this family felt, and that this particular character felt. And she was really clear exactly why it had to be written, and it had nothing to do with hockey. And so and that's why these kids have to read these stories and have to have access to these stories, and why I'm so lucky to be able to engage with them and have the opportunity to engage with them. So.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Wendy. I'm going to go back to Lawrence now that we've mentioned mirrors and windows, and I consider you a manufacturer of mirrors and windows as an author. Your writing explores real and complex histories, and at times your books have been challenged because of the language and the lived experiences that you depict in your stories. I'm always cautious about putting too much of a burden on the authors that we work with, or the authors that we know are being challenged in schools or in libraries. But I think it's interesting to explore and to know more about, how does it feel as an author to have your work questioned and challenged in schools and libraries? And what do you say to parents and educators who worry about teens engaging with the complex themes in your books and others' books?
Well, thank you, Michelle. Well, I like to have my books challenged and discussed intellectually. I mean, one of my favorite activities is go into prisons for young offenders and for adults, federal penitentiaries, and talk to prisoners who've been reading my stuff. And sometimes, if a prisoner has nothing better to do, they'll read a book super closely because they do have some time on their hands, and will say, I noticed that you wrote this on page 20, but you seem to contradict yourself on page 491. How do you justify that? And I enjoy being challenged and having, rigorous or demanding or challenging conversations about the things I've written about. What I, of course, don't enjoy is when people take it upon themselves to decide what is fit for others to read. Limiting what young people especially are allowed to read is a way of limiting their knowledge, limiting the range and the gamut of their conversations, limiting their possibilities for learning, and limiting the possibility of civil discourse in a classroom about difficult and complicated issues. And as I write about the history of Black peoples in the world and in Canada and in the diaspora, and as I dramatize these things, whether they're historical or present day or future, naturally I go to the language that I've grown up with, and I go to the sorts of language that sometimes is painful that I've encountered and that most Black people have. And so that creeps into my books if I'm trying to write authentically about the things that people are saying and hearing and dealing with. And so when a writer is writing and using kind of, say, racially charged language, they're not just using words in isolation. They're examining social issues, and these words crop up in the context of those social issues. So naturally, I'm deeply worried by tendencies to limit children's access to challenging and thoughtful and deep and authentic literature, because those books provide an occasion for conversations. And if you're eliminating books that have, say, racially explosive language, you're also eliminating books that deal with racially explosive issues and that attempt to make sense of them and attempt to help people guide their thinking and the way through these things to a better world. So it's very troubling that to see adults sort of arrogate upon themselves the right to decide what they think children should be reading and shouldn't.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that, Lawrence. And Maria, I know that you are around, you are engaging in these conversations regularly with people who are purchasing books for schools. And so you're in a unique position to see how books are selected and marketed and sometimes even censored in some way before they are able to reach readers. So I'm curious about your thoughts on this conversation around what makes a book, quote unquote, safe for a school, or the conversations around, I know we've had conversations in the past about, more joyful reading or reading that is less stressful or confrontational for teens. So how do you approach those conversations and just making sure that what Lawrence was just reflecting on, which is ensuring authentic stories are available to young readers? How do we balance these conversations?
Yeah, it's sometimes very, very tough. And there is a fine line because, we have to be respectful. I want to start by saying that most of the customers I see do want books that are authentic and representative of all voices. There's always been a pressure to keep books safe for schools and libraries, but historically, it's been more about age appropriateness rather than, gender diversity, LGBT representation. But because in the last few years, thankfully, there's been like a plethora of publishing happening around diverse voices and underrepresented voices, that we're starting to see some of the tough issues, as Lawrence as Lawrence books deal with as well, because we haven't heard these stories before. We keep hearing the same stories over and over again, and they start out being issue-based because we have to understand history and truths. And then eventually we just start seeing representation. And I think that, there's a lot of fear around, sometimes the difficult conversation is with a librarian or a teacher who may not agree that the book should be removed, but they have to listen to their administration. And, I've had some difficult conversations with library staff who maybe don't know how to advocate for a book, who actually have some prejudices themselves and aren't willing to, to hear another side. They've either been told by their administration or a parent is challenging for the book to, challenging them to remove the book. And sometimes the customer just has been told flat out, do not buy any books like this. They just want, as you said, Michelle, they might just want books that are funny and joyful. But, anyone who's gone through the teen years knows that teen years aren't always joyful and funny. And who defines what's joyful? In my story at the beginning, I told you about this boy who, all he read probably was stories that were joyful and happy. And he's thinking, what's wrong with me? Why can't I be happy? So when there is a challenge, I always try to give the customer as much information as I can to understand the reason for keeping the book, for maybe that child doesn't have to read it, but everyone else should have access to it, because there's plenty of support for books. I read journals, the industry news and industry journals that have reviews by professionals, that support the book. And I can always send them information to help them, present their case for keeping a book. But if the librarian or the customer is not on board to start with, then that's when it becomes difficult. And again, I will just always continue to bring a variety of books that represent all different subject matters and voices And I try to provide examples to customers of books that are just the same as this book, except maybe the characters are a little different. We have a return policy at Tinlids that we will not accept any books returned for any book that is trying to be returned related to topics of sexual orientation or gender or race or any matters of diversity. We just won't accept those. Age appropriateness is one thing, and I always try to judge books based on a criteria that will apply to all books. So, no gratuitous sex, no gratuitous violence, no prejudice, no hate, hate speech, or, and so you can always, teachers and librarians have also selection policies. And if they just follow those policies and respect all human beings, then, they can definitely advocate. But I think that they're just so worried about losing their jobs. So, it's important to listen to the concerns, but it's also important to stand up for what we believe in and to have those difficult conversations. So.
Mhm. Thank you for that, Maria. And on that line of, teens not necessarily gravitating towards joy, I think we had a conversation when we were pulling this panel together of what we all were reading when we were teens. And yeah, it can get a little, dare I say, bleak, realistic, maybe gritty. I like this grit lit category. Wendy, you see firsthand what students are gravitating towards in the library and the impact of a diverse collection of books, what that impact has on their curiosity and their own identity and their learning. So tell us a little bit more about, from your perspective, what those conversations look like. Maria spoke about advocacy and speaking with the people that are buying the books. But when these conversations are happening with parents or with administrators who have limited knowledge about a book or like the collection policies of the library, what strategies are you using to advocate for students in those situations?
That's an excellent question. So the first thing I would say is that my stock answer is that there's no such thing as an appropriate book. And I ardently feel that in the very core of my being. My answer is always, when a student comes to me and says, "Mrs. Burch-Jones, this book is inappropriate," and I say, "Inappropriate for whom?" And then we have a conversation about it, and we talk about the fact that if it's inappropriate for them as a reader, that's okay. And but then I say, "Oh, is it inappropriate for me? Is it and they go, oh, and there's always a lot of backpedaling. But the reality is I genuinely believe, the book was published. So clearly somebody thinks it's an appropriate book for somebody. There is a target audience for this book. And if you're not the target audience, that's okay. And we have conversations about taking their own internal temperature, and what's appropriate for them as a reader might not be appropriate for somebody else as a reader. And that's okay. In our school community, there are two ground rules in our library space. One is that there is no censorship in that space. And we make a really clear delineation between who has agency where. That teachers absolutely 100% have agency over reading material in the classroom. We have conversations that, Mr. Skipper is a really great teacher, and he's going to tell you that there are books that you need to read in the classroom there because he's good at what he does, and he's going to tell you got to read this stuff, and you're going to read it, and he's going to help you become a better reader. But in the library, that's where students have agency, 100% agency to choose what they want to read. That the library is where we are trying to encourage them to choose what they want to read to help create reading joy. And that, again, to the very core of my being, believe that every reader has the right to see themselves reflected on the shelves in every aspect of their intersectional identity. And that is a hill I will die on. And so when I am having conversations with parents, when I'm having conversations with administrators, again, going back to windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors, that whether or not this is a book that reflects your own personal beliefs or, beliefs around what is appropriate for you or your family is again, that's within your realm of what you have choice over what your student or your child reads at home. But this library is a choice where they get to choose. And so if you don't want them to take it home, that's your choice. You can choose for them not to read it at home, but this space is where they get to advocate. And you don't get to choose for anybody else. You can choose for your own child, but I'm also not going to tell them what they can and cannot take out of the library. And so I will, and again, it's a hill I will die on. I just can't. And the words I start throwing around are words like censorship and book banning. And as soon as I start using those words and those phrases, because that's what they're doing, that's what they're asking to do. They're asking, once they start talking about inappropriate books, they're asking me to censor. They're asking me to start pulling books from the shelf. That's censorship. Is that what they want me to do? No, thank you. I'm not going to start censoring books. If an administrator starts talking about that, when I'm talking to my other school library professional colleagues, I say, start using those words, start using those phrases. It starts changing people's thought processes really quickly, because that's really what we're talking about. And when they start sort of thinking about it in those phrases, the idea of an inappropriate text for a child, for a reader, versus censorship. I mean, it's a fine line, but really that's what they're talking about. They're talking about wanting to censor books. And that's not a place I'm willing to let them go.
It's an interesting conversation. And I'm just curious, Lawrence mentioned earlier, critical reception of his work and how he's willing to engage in these conversations, critical critique of the work. And it's an interesting practice to get teens into, which is, you don't like this book. Let's talk about that. Yeah. And also in their recreational reading, then don't read it. Stop reading it. There's a different book for you. You don't have to like every book. And also you don't get the chance to, prevent someone else from reading it. I think there's such an interesting democratic lesson in giving them the freedom to stop reading it and also talk about why they don't like something.
We have the conversation every fall about the fact that books inherently are art. They're art. And we don't expect everybody to like the same movies. We don't expect everyone to like the same TV shows. We don't expect everyone to like the same pieces of visual art. And we shouldn't expect everyone to like the same books either. I have the whole conversation around The Walking Dead in my household. I'm not a fright fiction person. I am not a good person with jump scare, and I cannot manage The Walking Dead. I have tried several times. My family and my kids and my husband love it. I can't watch it. I've tried. I really have to humor my kids, but I can't watch it. I just can't do it. It's not good for me to do it. It's just not a good idea. And so we have to have that conversation with my students, because a whole bunch of them love it. And I tell them, don't even tell me what happens. I don't want to know. Because that's just not a good idea for Mrs. Burch-Jones. And so, yeah, horror and fright fiction, same idea. How I ever got through Stephen King in grade 8, I have no idea. But it's not for me. So I certainly won't pick it up now. No offense to Stephen King, just not my cup of tea.
Could I just pick up on Wendy's reference to censorship for a minute?
Mm-hmm.
Is that okay?
Oh, go for it. Yes, absolutely.
I mean, censorship plays out in so many ways, and there's the kind of example that Wendy's referred to, and then there are subtle and equally nefarious and challenging other manifestations of censorship. Let's say a teacher in grade 11 wants to teach a challenging novel that has some racially derogatory language that's a really interesting read, whether it's Toni Morrison or David Cherry-Andy or Essia Dilgen or any sort of, for example, any Black writer who's writing authentically about the sorts of things that they might write about in a serious book that kids in grade 11 would be fully ready to read. If that teacher is aware that their principal does not have their back, that their school board superintendent does not have their back, that there's no edict from the Ontario Ministry of Education encouraging the reading of diverse texts exploring diverse human stories, if that sole teacher wants to teach but perceives that she or he will be swimming an uphill fight if there's any challenge, that becomes a form of censorship. And that teacher is probably going to say, well, I'll just save my career, especially if they're in their first years of teaching. I'll just teach something that I know nobody's possibly going to object to. I won't teach this challenging work because I know I'm going to land in hot water. And so she or he has to self-censor to protect their careers against sort of a massive tide of kind of intolerance about challenging or difficult books. And so that also constitutes, unfortunately, a form of censorship from within, because a teacher knows that their superiors, so to speak, they need to have their backs. And if they don't have their backs, they're going to be in trouble. So that's also very worrisome. Many teachers would like to teach challenging books, but think they'll land in hot water if they do.
Mhm. Absolutely. And I think that leads into my next question, which is about fear.
Mhm.
And, we know that book challenges often come from a place of fear of what ideas a young person might encounter, or what it means for the development of their ideas. So let's talk a little bit about that fear. Maria, where do you think this fear comes from, and how can we shift that fear into an opportunity to grow and to learn?
Well, I think that parents fear that their teens can't handle anything outside of their traditional ideas that they've grown up with, traditional roles and beliefs. I think that sometimes parents haven't grown with their child. They still see them as very young. Um, they are not confident in what they may not even know what their children are exposed to in the real world, because can't be with them 24/7 when they're teenagers, but they still see them as young kids. And if they want their teens to communicate with them, then I think they need to not make the teen feel like they can't be trusted. I was reading a Catherine Applegate book, The One and Only Family. It's a young junior novel this weekend. And one of the messages that I got in her book was that a parent's most important job is not to protect their young ones in the world. It's to prepare them. And I thought that was so relevant to our discussion today, because we think that we are protecting our kids by not exposing them to new ideas and new characters and new stories, different stories that may contradict the traditional stories that they've heard. Whatever, whether it's nonfiction or fiction. And so how are their teens going to be able to deal with tough topics and grow if they don't experience these stories and characters in a safe and a hopeful way? How are they going to learn those skills if they never encounter, until they may encounter it themselves directly? So I think that parents, adults, we're not equipped to answer every single question that a teen may have, and teens are curious. And, going back to our earlier discussions about, what we were like as teens. I mean, for one thing, adults are now writing to the teen audience, where, when I was a teenager, there were very few authors. Did I say adults or authors? Authors who were writing for that age group. So I was reading adult books, which was fine. My parents didn't read English, so they hardly knew what I was reading anyway. It was fine. The beauty of that. But again, these are our authors who have dedicated their writing to the teen audience. And so, all of the topics, whether they're tough or not, are hopefully relevant for that audience. And kids are going to be better off with books than they are with what they're learning on social media. The books are the tools that will help, with the fears that parents have. Teachers and librarians, they have different fears. They have fears of losing their job or having the challenges, but parents, I think that's what a parent's fear is, that their child will just be exposed to something that is going to traumatize them. And they're already exposed to much worse. I just want to say one thing. I remember there was this book, a Canadian author, Martine Levitt, and she wrote a book called oh shoot, I wish I could remember the name of it now. It was the story of it was basically about the Picton murders, and it was My Book of Life by Angel, I think it was called. And I was presenting it, and part of that talk with the young teens in the school was that when I presented that book, and it talked about how easily it is for a teenager to come from a safe, happy home and end up on the streets, it was brilliantly done. It was one of the best books I've ever read. And this student said, "Oh, I know that story because it's Ed Sheeran's video, The A-Team, an Ed Sheeran song, The A-Team. So of course, you know, if you watch that video, The A-Team, it is a story about a girl who ends up on the streets and who, you know, is addicted to drugs. It's actually a much more serious and graphic depiction of that plot line. And so, you know, parents, you know, your kids are watching these videos and they already have this information. But if you read Martine Levitt's book, there's hope and there's strength and there's great role models. And it's a difficult book, but it's an amazing book. And I couldn't believe that that kid made this connection. And one of the, just one more thing, you know, one of the magical moments in that video is that she's standing in front of a subway station and it's called Angel Subway, which just sent chills down my spine. Like, sorry, it just was just such a, I don't know, it was just so powerful. So
Yeah.
Maybe I'm getting off topic, but anyway, I think that, you know, they are afraid of ideas and, you know, they shouldn't be, because that is what's going to help their child become an adult and be safe.
Absolutely. Oh, the things I learned from the Coca-Cola countdown music videos on Much Music in the 90s and 80s. Let me tell you. Wendy, I can see you've got something to say about this, yeah?
Yeah, when as Maria was talking, I kept thinking that I think that in my experience, that teachers and parents and administrators, the fear comes out of what ifs. And an encounter with a colleague who reached out to me not too long ago, and a student had brought her a note back with a book, a grade 2 student, with a graphic novel called The New Girl. It's the story of a young girl from Romania, about in grade 5, who comes and emigrates to Canada. And amongst all of the other issues in coming to a new country, she also gets her period for the first time. Her older sister, of the student who brought it, had also taken out this book previously, her older sister being in grade 5. And now the younger sister was wanting to take out the book. Sorry, Helen. But the teacher now had sent it back with a note saying this book is inappropriate. And in the follow-up in conversation, it came to be that the teacher had all of these questions about possible questions the student was going to ask, this 7-year-old was going to ask about all of these questions around the content of the book and all of these other things. And at no point was there any conversation with the student. At no point was there any conversation with the student about why she took it out, about, with the parent, about anything else. But it was just, she saw the book, she knew and it was just, it has to go back, it's inappropriate. So of course, first of all, that's censorship. And second of all, it was all completely based on these what if possible conversations that potentially could happen. And she has no idea why that child wanted to take out that book. Maybe she's starting to notice, her changes in her own body, because that's happening younger and younger and younger now. And maybe she's noticing all this stuff happening with her older sister and has a whole bunch of questions. Maybe she robbed those sisters of this incredible bonding opportunity. Maybe she robbed the mother and the daughter from having this incredible opportunity to have some really great conversation. We have no idea why that child took out that book from the library. But this adult made a decision based on some potentially difficult questions that she imagined might happen, not even at school, but potentially at home, that she was afraid might happen. And it was all fear-based. It was 100% fear-based around potentially difficult conversations. She has no idea whether the mother was going to have whether that was going to be a difficult conversation for that family. But she made a snap decision, and it was completely rooted in fear. There was no curiosity whatsoever, and there were no questions asked. And that was my issue in all of that, was that there were no questions asked. So when I gave my colleagues some advice in terms of follow-up, I told her to ask a whole lot of questions. Because the reality was, it was censorship out and out, but it was all rooted in the possible what if questions. And my experience is that in most cases, and as Maria touched on this too, and actually so did Lawrence, that all of the difficult conversations that we imagine are happening are ones that adults project. It's the adults that are projecting the difficult. That in my experience, The kids don't have any issue talking about these things. The kids relish the difficult conversations. They want to have the difficult conversations. In my experience, when my readers in the Forest of Reading, when they come and want to talk about these books, those are the questions, those are the things they want to talk about. They don't want to talk about what was their favorite part in the book. That's not what they want to talk about. They don't want to talk about, the setting. That's not what they want to talk about. They want to talk about the grit. That's what they want. And they're absolutely ready for it. But it's the adults who don't have the language, the adults who don't have the resources to be able to know how to have those conversations. And for me, that's where we need the most education. That's where we need the most, I guess, professional development in my case, to be able to give adults, for me in a school setting, the ability to have those conversations and to know how to navigate those conversations, because the kids, in my experience, they're ready for it and they're eager for it. They're hungry for it. They really want to have those conversations.
That's really interesting. And it does keep coming back to us as library professionals, as authors, as book people, making those opportunities available for young people to maybe not even always engage in those conversations, but see them happen. And even just witnessing a difficult conversation or two people who have different opinions, having a conversation about why that is and coming to a conclusion. It's like, you hear parenting advice always, let your kids watch you fight. Let your kids see you have disagreements with your partner, because they need to know that sometimes in marriage you have conflict and you're going to get through it, and there are healthy ways to have conversations. So I find that very interesting. Lawrence, did you have something to add to that point?
Yes, thank you, Michelle. For sure, fear can be a factor. Maybe you're afraid that a child in question is going to be traumatized or hurt by a subject in a book. I agree, fear can be a factor, but I think we're missing that often what drives people to ban or censor books isn't just fear. Often it's control of the narrative. It might be ideologically based. You might believe that children should not be reading LGBTQ positive books, or shouldn't be reading books about the history of the internment of Japanese Canadians during World War II, or shouldn't be reading about slavery in Canada. You might have an opposition to children reading books that contain racially explosive language because you don't think they should be hearing those words. And so I don't think it's just about fear. I think it's about controlling a narrative and controlling children's worldview and controlling what your children are exposed to if it happens to be something you disagree with. So if you're, say, profoundly in disagreement with birth control and abortion, and there's a novel for young readers or for teenage readers about a girl who maybe has to contemplate such things, it could be that you're opposing the reading of such a book on ideological lines. You want to control the narrative. And so I think that also drives much of the moves to ban or censor books.
That's very interesting. So I guess where this is leading is, given, if we give into this controlling of the narrative, to the loss of these difficult conversations, where are we headed? What's at stake? As we move down this road, what do you all see as the loss for teens when we restrict books that reflect their real life experiences? And how do we get them to equip themselves to better engage critically with those reading materials? Who wants to start that one? Wait, Maria?
I'll start. Well, the one big thing for me, I think, is we lose credibility. If we're giving our kids books and they see them as lame, as they often will say, they won't believe that first of all, they won't believe that we trust them with the tough stuff. And I really think that trust is a big factor in all of this. And I think that we lose credibility, which means we will lose readers. If you give them a book they don't like over and over again, they're just going to think you're never going to give them, we have friends like that. Like, I have a friend who gives me books she thinks I'm going to love, and I never love them. So I don't really trust her. I mean, they're good for her and someone else, but they're just not what I would gravitate towards in adult literature. So I think that's number one for me. And we lose the chance to show them that we trust them with real life experiences, and that we lose the chance to show them that they're not alone, or or we lose the chance for them to experience things, you know, in a safe environment. And I think that how we equip them is that we need to respect their choices. We need to allow them to practice being an adult. You know, if they feel supported enough and that they won't be judged, then they'll be able to discuss all of these difficult topics with, you know, without fear of judgment or without feeling like their parent is going to disapprove in any way. And I think the other way that we need to equip teens so that they can, you know, get through these difficult topics is that we need to, it would really help if we had school libraries that were actually up to date with current relevant material, and had a professional in the library that could actually guide them and have great conversations with them. I didn't have a strong school library in elementary school, but boy, when I went to high school, my school librarian was the person I went to for everything. She was incredible. And I always felt like the whole world was open to me when I went there, because she would talk about anything. So I think that having a healthy school library collection is also, you know, super important. And, you know, and just allowing kids to read what they gravitate towards. There's a reason that they choose what they choose, and just trust the process. So.
Absolutely. Wendy?
I think Maria touched on something really important there, which was that library collections, I mean, all library collections, but especially school library collections, when we talk about our teenagers, they need to be relevant. The school that I'm at right now, I'm in my 3rd year there, and I have done a lot of work to make that collection relevant. When I first got there, the average age of titles in that collection was 1996, which is like decades before any of those kids were even born. So like they didn't want to read any of the titles in that library because they weren't relevant, you know, at all. So never mind being reflective of their lived experiences or their identities in any way, shape, or form. And so you know, our circulation was really it was quite frankly, it was, well, it just was not great. Let's just put it that way. And I have boosted circulation at this point by, I forget what the number is. It's something ridiculous, like over 400%, because I have worked really, really hard and spent a lot of money to make that collection relevant and reflective of my school community. And when I say in every aspect of their intersectional identity, it's not just about their race or their gender identity or it's also about how they perceive themselves in terms of their hobbies, in terms of their interests. You know, our intersectional identity is every aspect of how we see ourselves. You know, I'm not just a teacher librarian. I'm also a mom. I'm a gardener. I'm, you know, a reader. We are the sum total of all of our parts. And so when I make sure I'm looking at my collection, I'm trying to allow them to see themselves in every aspect of our collection. So, you know, did I buy a whole lot of new dinosaur books too? I sure did, because I have a whole lot of burgeoning paleontologists in my school. And a whole lot of, you know, wannabe pilots in my school. So I've got a really great new section about planes too, because I've got a huge number of kids seemingly that really like planes. And so that's what it means to have a relevant collection at my school, in my school community. And so it also means that in my school community, based on my students, I also want to make sure I have books that are about, you know, pilots who reflect the different nationalities and, you know, of the schools in my community. So I want to have pictures of girls in hijabs in a plane, and pictures of, you know, African Americans in a plane, and books about, you know, Canadians in a plane, because that is my school community, and they deserve to see themselves reflected in our shelves. So it's not just about having new books written by, you know, authors in the 21st century, but it also is about having books that where they see themselves reflected on the shelves. And so it's really that relevance piece is really key. Because if they don't see books that they want to take out of the library and read, then they're not going to want to read them. So that relevance piece is really, really important.
Thanks, Wendy.
Really, really important.
Lawrence, what about from your perspective? What do you see as being at stake if we don't make some changes?
Well, children, they either are experiences or have experienced or might soon experience dramatic things in lives. I mean, we have children in our schools and in our country who've come from zones of genocide, who worried about bombs going off over their overhead, who've had their roofs blown off their houses, who faced starvation or seen death up close. And we have other students who, of course, hopefully haven't experienced those things, but are aware of them because they see the news, or they watch news online, or they hear from friends, or they might pick up newspapers still, or they're learning about, they turn on the TV, they learn about these things if they're not experiencing them. And so to deny children the access to materials, to books and articles that explore these things, is to deny them the opportunity to make sense of them. Can you imagine like holding a child for 18 years in your living room without ever exposing them to the challenges of the world? And then saying, you're 18 now, you can go out and live your life. Of course we don't. We want to prepare our children to assume adulthood and to be ready for it and to move into the world. So we expose our children to difficult and challenging things so they learn how to navigate through life and take care of themselves and be good people. And so what we lose by banning and censoring books is the opportunity to teach our children and to let them teach themselves about how to navigate through life's myriad challenges and joys, for that matter. And so we vastly underestimate the intelligence and the ability of children to make sense of books and other forms of media that they consume. We constantly underestimate their intelligence and their ability to make sense of these things. And we out of fear, out of control, desire to control the narrative, we often, unfortunately, try to limit their access to really important things. If you're hearing the N-word on the way to school and on the way back to school, listening to hip hop music, how are you possibly going to be harmed more by reading a book that employs the word and discussing it in a civil, moderated, thoughtful way in class? They're hearing it all the time anyway. So how does it suddenly harm them to read a book in which that word appears and to have a thoughtful, civil, respectful conversation about it in class?
Again, just picking up on something else that Lawrence said, is that it's also about erasure. If we allow all of our, for instance, LGBTQIA plus books to be removed off the shelf, you're also telling an important, segment of our population and of those students in our schools that your identity doesn't matter, that part of you does not matter, that part of you that you need, that for some of them that you need to hide it, that you should not be seen, that and you are very much telling them that this is not a safe space for you. So it is very much an issue of equity. It's a matter of inclusion, and quite frankly, it's a matter for the Human Rights Code. So and in public boards, it contravenes the Canadian Human Rights Code. So there's that too. It is very much at odds with in Ontario the Education Act, and it puts teachers at odds with our standards of practice, and pits us, in terms of our standards of practice and what we're told we need to be doing in terms of inclusion and equity, and the Human Rights Code. And then what you're telling us we need to be pulling from the shelves, and it's so contradictory and puts us in such a difficult position.
Excellent. Okay, we're coming towards the end of our time together. You've all spoken very eloquently. Thank you about what you're all seeing teens engaging with, what's at stake, and if we take these books off the shelf, what it means to the next generation. Let's leave on a happy, on a positive note here and talk about what we can do to make some changes. So we hope, we likely have some parents, some educators, some library people listening to this conversation who might want to take an active step in supporting freedom to read for teens. Let's go around and share one concrete thing that you would suggest to those listeners. What can they do right now to foster an environment that encourages and promotes reading? And I'm going to start with you, Wendy, because you're nodding the most rapidly. I did that. I'm sorry. I jinxed you there.
It's okay. Sorry, Helen. No problem. This one is easy. So I would say the easiest thing to do is to make sure that your school board or your district has a robust and clear selection and deselection policy for books and resources. And to make sure that it also has a very, very clear section that addresses book challenges. It is the easiest way to make sure that your school library professionals and your administrators are protected and supported. And if your school board or your district already has one, great. If you don't, the Ontario School Library Association has a very fantastic selection guide that they can help guide you. It has some excellent examples, and hopefully maybe somebody can put that in the chat, a link in the chat. And if you do already have one, then again, great. Make sure that your school library professionals and your administrators know about it. Make sure that they know about it. Make sure that because that document protects them, and it means that they have that support. A lot don't. It's how my colleague got into some hot water because her administrator didn't know about it. Because if they have that and they have that book challenge policy, it will really clearly outline exactly how challenges go forward. It means really that it's really clearly outlined step by step by step. So, but that's the easiest thing to do.
Absolutely. We'll put the link to that resource in the show notes for sure. Maria, would you like to go next?
Sure, yeah. Well, I think that if parents and educators want to support freedom to read and get their teens reading more, I think that they have to prioritize reading themselves. I think that they have to model that for their teens. Choose some books that are really difficult that you think may be challenging and talk about them, and even if your teen doesn't want to read the book that you're reading, but I think that by doing that, you're opening the door up for communication. And, when Lawrence was talking about what we lose is the opportunity to teach, well, we also lose the opportunity to learn together. When you have a conversation with your teenager about an important issue in the world or a new character that you've never encountered or whatever the topic is, you start to learn what kind of adult your child is. And I think for educators and parents, often I hear, I don't have time to read. Well, then if you don't have time to read, you're not prioritizing it, and you should not expect your teen to have time to read either. So I've heard English heads say this. So I'm thinking, why do we have English heads if they're not reading? Don't get me started. Anyway, so that would be my number one thing. And also to let them choose and to respect their choices.
Excellent advice. Thank you, Maria. And finally, Lawrence.
Well, I would definitely echo what Wendy and Maria say. On a more personal level, first I'll start with a playful observation. I read somewhere in the New York Times a few weeks ago that some parent had offered her child $100 to read a couple of books in the recent past, and it was quite entertaining and a really interesting and provocative idea. I'll pay you to read some books if you just read these books. I never quite went there as a parent when my children were young, and I don't think I'd go there now, say as a grandparent. But there's something to be said for figuring out what at the individual level, as a parent, as an educator, as a librarian, what does the child who's coming to you love? What turns them on? What excites them? Well, this child likes to know about the history of Ireland. Well, maybe I'll get them a book about the early IRA or something like that. Or this parent likes father-son memoir, so maybe I'll buy them a book that sort of explores a father-son memoir. Getting to know the passions and the personal interests of the child who appears before you, whether it's your own child or in a library or in a classroom, is a great way to say, hey, I know this book. I think it would really excite you. I read the first chapter. Take a look. I think it'll speak to your interest about airplanes or something like that. And so knowing the interests of your children and equipping them with books that sort of reinforce and excite those interests will stimulate further reading. Any reading is good reading. So if you can, in my opinion, so if you can get your child reading something that excites them, they'll probably go on to something else right after that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And graphic novels and audiobooks count as reading.
I was just going to say, Michelle, reading is reading is reading. It all counts. It doesn't matter whether they are reading. Maybe they want to read about the news online. These kids are addicted to their screen. That's okay.
Mhm.
Reading is reading is reading. It all counts.
Yep.
That's would be my only other advice is do not judge the method by which your child wants to engage in reading.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I want to thank all of you, Maria, Wendy, Lawrence. Thank you so much for your time today, your expertise, for sharing your thoughts on this really important topic, this topic that is popping up for all of us more and more these days, getting teens to read, helping teens, supporting them in the choices they're making around reading. Thank you all so much for your work on this today.
Thank you very much. It's great to speak with you and meet you. I hope to see you again in person soon.
Absolutely. Thank you, and happy Freedom to Read Week.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye, all.
you.